This is a war of choice in which the United States is acting to destabilize the status quo. I think plenty of people in the Gulf will ask themselves, what good is it for us to be part of an American security system where we don't get a say in what the Americans do and in which we are on the front line of any reactions?
Do you think this war has been a similar watershed moment for them?
I think there'll be some difficult conversations with the Trump administration about how can you have put us out here without considering our security.
The US-Israeli war with Iran has sent missiles sailing across the Middle East, dragged in countries from the Gulf to Lebanon to Iraq, and thrown the global economy into turmoil. But amid the chaos, it did manage to bring peace to one part of the region. After weeks of not speaking, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the President Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates shared their first phone call. And it's with good reason. Traditionally seen as islands of luxury in a region of conflict, the Gulf countries have now been thrust into the center of the violence, facing Iranian drone and missile attacks, as well as calls to join the fighting from the US and Israel. As they scramble to contain the fallout and recover the economic damage, the two erstwhile rivals have been forced to set their competition aside and attempt to de-escalate the conflict. So, how are Saudi Arabia and the UAE looking at this moment? Has the Iran war changed their thinking on foreign policy? And how might the Gulf region be transformed as a result? Here to answer those questions is Gregory Gause III, an associate fellow at the Middle East Institute and an expert on the history and politics of Saudi Arabia. Gregory, thank you so much for being here to speak to Middle East Eye today.
My pleasure.
So I want to begin to obviously discuss recent events with you. The Gulf region has been thrust into the center of a conflict that they did not start, with Iran firing drones and missiles at both Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the rest of the GCC countries. I want to ask you, how united are views in the Gulf about this war, about how they might choose to respond, and about the threats on the table currently?
They're very united, and I think that this fits a pattern that we've seen in the past. When the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the monarchical states of the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, think that their threat environment is relatively benign, all sorts of differences among them can arise. But when serious external threats present themselves, they tend to band together. And I think that that's what we're seeing right now. This is an extremely threatening environment for all the Gulf states. They've been subject to Iranian missile and drone attacks now for over a week. Those missile and drone attacks, while successfully met in the vast majority of cases by the militaries of the Gulf states, some of them have gotten through and done real damage to important elements of Gulf infrastructure and perhaps even more importantly to the global picture of the Gulf states as safe, reliable places to invest, to do business, to visit and to trade with. And I think that that's the biggest damage that this war is doing to the Gulf states for the long term. They've been very united on first advising the Trump administration and representing themselves to the Trump administration that they don't encourage this kind of conflict with Iran, that they prefer the diplomatic path and that they're much more interested in regional stability than in this kind of instability and chaos, which might or might not lead to better results in the longer term. I can imagine that the Crown Prince represented to the president that Saudi Arabia didn't think that this war was a good idea. But when he was convinced that President Trump was going to do it anyway, I wouldn't be surprised if he said, well, you better do it right. In other words, don't leave an angered and embittered Iranian regime in power that's going to continue to target Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. I can imagine that conversation happened, but I'm confident that in terms of the overall strategic advice that Saudi Arabia was giving to the administration in the months leading up to this was that they preferred stability.
I Imagine, as you said, they didn't want this war, but now they are in it. They're worried about the long-term effects. After all, they are in the region with Iran. The US is not. How are they looking at their next steps in terms of it seems quite clear on the US and Israel's part that they'd like the Gulf states to join the war in a greater capacity. It's also clear that Iran has progressively widened its target range in the Gulf. How are they looking at prospects of joining the conflict and of what they'd like the endgame in Iran to look like?
So we know what they don't want the endgame in Iran to look like. They don't want either complete chaos and state collapse in Iran, which I think is unlikely, but it's a possibility. We've certainly seen it in other places recently in the region, whether it was Iraq after the American invasion in '03 or Libya most recently, the civil wars in Syria and Yemen. I don't think that any of the Gulf states want to see a completely chaotic, failed state in Iran that could have enormous spillover effects, population movements, non-state actors, all sorts of things. So I don't think they want that. I also don't think that they want if you will, an angry and empowered Iranian regime uh, able to continue these kinds of direct attacks on Gulf infrastructure. I think that they would like to see an end state in which an Iranian regime that is still in control of its military and in control of its territory comes to some kind of an agreement, in effect, something of a ceasefire with the United States and Israel that will then redound to the stability of the Gulf. In terms of joining the fight, all of the states have been extremely careful in their public presentation of their involvement to emphasize that their responses have been defensive, that they're defending their territory and defending their airspace better than I think some people probably supposed they could, certainly better than I thought that they could. But they are not joining in offensive attacks on Iran. In fact, many of the Gulf states, when they report that they've shot down or intercepted X number of missiles or Y number of drones, don't even say what the origin of those, where those drones and missiles came from. Everybody knows it's Iran, but they're even avoiding that kind of public statement. I think in order to preserve the idea that after this war ends, they can find some kind of rapprochement, some kind of political understanding with Iran, which up until after the 6 Day War and before this latest iteration, I think that they thought they might have achieved.
I guess then, how do you see the statements of, for example, US senators like Lindsey Graham, who's been quite public on social media in kind of almost goading the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, to join this war. And you've had some kind of seeming leaks in Israeli media claiming that there have been military actions.
Well, I think that the Israeli leaks are pretty clear. They want to couple the Gulf states' military strategic view with their own. And the Gulf states, even the ones in the Abraham Accords, like the UAE, have resisted that in terms of this war.
As you mentioned, the approach of the Gulf states has been overall extremely cautious, extremely considered. But still, this war has put Iran back on the map, or at least to the top of their radar. Do you think that is permanent now, that given the instability in Iran and kind of the very uncertain outcome of this war, do you think it has reintroduced Iran to the top of the threat list at a time when focus seemed to be shifting elsewhere towards Israel, even amongst each other, as we noted? Is this a very strong and permanent reversal of their security priorities?
Well, I would say that nothing is permanent in the Middle East, but I think that this attack has certainly decreased the confidence that the Gulf states will have in their ability to, if you will, engage Iran in a way that takes them off the Iranian target list. I think it's just inevitable. And you see in commentary coming out of the Gulf states, a real sense that the Iranians have treated them unjustly, if you will, in this war. in that they tried to stay out, they discouraged the Americans from doing it, and that they have not directly joined the attack. And there's a real sense that the Iranians have kind of unfairly targeted them. And that will, I think, carry over for a bit. But the one thing that's not going to change is that the Gulf states have, to various degrees, all developed long-term economic plans that emphasize growing their non-oil elements of their economy, of becoming more central nodes in world trade, world finance, world transport, world logistics, and things like AI. And that requires stability, and that doesn't change no matter what the result of this war is.
I get the sense that in achieving that stability, the Gulf, at least judging from the commentary, has been disappointed both in that sense of betrayal from Iran, as you noted, in attacking them, but also in a sense which goes beyond this war, but in a sense that they had been let down by the US somewhat, or deprioritized in comparison to Israel's needs, and left a bit like sitting ducks, a bit undefended. Because the two things they've invested in, which is a close relationship with the US, some of them to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, and a rapprochement with Iran, neither of them have been able to very effectively protect them when this moment came. So is that the way they're feeling? And if so, where does that stability and that security on which they pride themselves come from?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, in the immediate term, when Iranian missiles and drones are flying at you, you're going to focus on the Iranian threat. But in the longer term, I think that we will hear more from the Gulf states that America as a destabilizer. And that is clearly what this war is. I mean, this was not a war driven by some kind of new level of threat from Iran to American interests in the region. This is a war of choice in which the United States is acting to destabilize the status quo. I think plenty of people in the Gulf will ask themselves, what good is it for us to be part of an American security system where we don't get a say in what the Americans do, and in which we are on the front line of any reactions? The problem for the Gulf states is they don't have a broad range of choice here. They need external security partners, particularly the smaller states, but even Saudi Arabia. They need external security partners. China is not in a position to do that and doesn't appear to want to. Russia is engrossed in its own war in Ukraine and more aligned with Iran than it has been in the past. It seems to me that this is just part of the geopolitical reality that small states, particularly the Gulf states, in the situation they are in geographically and economically and strategically, is they're kind of wedded to a United States which they can influence, but they can't control. And this cuts both ways. We know that when it looked like past administrations were trying to do political deals with Iran, the Obama administration and the nuclear deal, the Gulf states were very nervous that they were being abandoned by the United States, that their interests were not being adequately taken care of. But when the United States gets very aggressive toward Iran, the Gulf states feel that they can be entrapped in wars that they don't want to fight, as they are now. I don't think that there's a solution to this problem. I think it is baked into the situation that the Gulf states find themselves in. And as much as they might like to find an alternative in terms of a security partner to deal with the numerous threats that they perceive, there really isn't a good alternative to the United States for the foreseeable future. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States doesn't have some fence mending to do here. If the Trump administration wants Gulf buy-in to whatever comes after this war, whether it be regarding Gaza, whether it be regarding future relations with Iran, whether it be regarding stabilization in Syria and Lebanon, the Trump administration is going to need the Gulf states. And I'm sure that the first thing the Gulf state leaders are going to say is, if you want our cooperation, you're going to have to explain to us how your behavior in recent months has strengthened our security. And that'll be an interesting conversation, which unfortunately those of us on the outside won't be able to listen in on.
As you mentioned, when they've been faced with this declining, what they see as US reliability, whether under Obama, Biden, Trump, this has been an issue with successive administrations. They have responded, at least initially, by trying to throw their weight around in the region more and pursue kind of independent regional policies. Initially with each other as partners. Increasingly, though, over recent years, they've diverged. I want to ask why this divergence in security outlook seems to have opened up in recent years.
I think that the UAE and Saudi Arabia saw themselves as being on the same page when both of them, during the first Trump administration, were taking a very aggressive stance toward Iran and completely backing the Trump administration, first Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on Iran. You also had the new leadership in Saudi Arabia with Prince Mohammed bin Salman as defense minister, and then from 2017 as crown prince, wanting to throw Saudi weight around in the region. It was a failure, right? Yemen was a quagmire. The boycott of Qatar didn't do any good and was eventually dropped. The effort to disrupt Lebanese politics through the kidnapping and resignation of the prime minister, Saad al-Hariri, from Riyadh just completely backfired. This was not working well. And it eventually ended up in the Iranian attack on the Saudi oil facilities in September of 2019. And it was there that the Saudis really, I think, started to change focus. The Emiratis as well. They reached out to Iran. They in fact, left the fight against the Houthis before the Saudis had their ceasefire with the Houthis. And so, in some sense, the Emiratis and the Saudis both began to appreciate that this very aggressive policy wasn't getting much done. I think where the difference comes is that the Saudis, with this new emphasis on stability, very much wanted to support existing governments, what they would call legitimate governments in Yemen. That of course, that's a government that doesn't control much of Yemen. But the sitting government in Sudan, for example, the new government in Syria. Whereas the UAE was kind of taking a leaf from the Iranian book and supporting non-state actors, whether it be the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, whether it be the RSF in Sudan. And this set the Saudis and the Emiratis on different sides of these issues. Yemen particularly, because the Saudis see Yemen, rightfully so, with the huge border with Saudi Arabia, as a strategic backyard for them. And they don't like anyone messing around in Yemen in ways that go against their definition of their interest. I think that's where we see the split coming. Now, I think that this war, particularly for the Emirates, is going to be a traumatic event. The Emirates really were the country that was most targeted by Iran. Interestingly enough, even though the Emirates has been an extremely important economic partner for Iran, and there's a substantial Iranian diaspora that lives in Dubai, and I think that this is probably quite shocking for the Emiratis and might occasion some rethinking of their overall security strategy going forward.
I want to bring it back to what you said in Yemen. There was that big offensive where you had two provinces being taken, including right on Saudi's border. And as you mentioned, it's a very sensitive issue for Saudi security. I wonder, the UAE knowing this, what could motivate it to undertake such a bold offensive, which I'm sure it knew would cross a Saudi red line in terms of what it considered acceptable?
This is pure speculation on my part. Certainly, there's been some press speculation that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's raising the Sudan issue with President Trump might have might have led the Emiratis to think that they needed to push back. Uh, we do have some reporting that President Trump told the Emiratis that the Saudis wanted the U.S. to sanction the Emirates, which I don't think is true. I think that the Saudis wanted Trump to sanction the RSF and get more involved in a Sudanese peace process. But it could have been miscommunication from the United States on that score. But I do think that while I really don't know what drove the Emirates on the Yemen front, might have been the STC themselves saying, "Look, we have an opportunity here. We think we can secure control of almost all of what used to be South Yemen." Uh, and the Emirates might have just said, "Well, if you think you can, the Saudis will eventually learn to live with that." A lot of misjudgment and miscommunication on this one. For me, going forward, the interesting thing will be, do the Emiratis do a big rethink on their regional strategy as a result of this war?
It's interesting you mentioned the role of kind of the US and the Trump administration in potentially being part of that miscommunication. Do you see his style of foreign policy as kind of playing into this rivalry or this competition between the two in terms of kind of like, drumming up investments from both and touring the region?
The only thing we have on the record from President Trump about the competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the tension between them is he was asked about it and he said, "Oh, that'll be very easy to fix." So we know where he stands on this, right? Um, I do think that there is somewhat of a difference in the way the Trump administration deals with the Gulf than has been the case in past administrations. Past administrations have very much emphasized an American desire for the Gulf to cooperate, to integrate their military systems, their early warning systems, their missile defense, to take united positions on political issues. The United States has pushed this since the creation of the GCC, since the Gulf War of 1990-91, even during the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s when the GCC was created back in 1981. The Trump administration, it seems to me, feels much more comfortable dealing with the Gulf states individually, kind of a hub and spoke approach. It's not that much different than the way past administrations ended up. They might have pushed the Gulf states to try to cooperate more, but they still had strong bilateral relations. But the Trump administration seems to be perfectly happy to just deal bilaterally with everybody. I do think that on Arab-Israeli questions, and particularly on Gaza, and we can extend this up to Lebanon, we can extend it into the Israeli interventions in Syria recently. I think that the problem for the Gulf states is that when they speak individually, their voice is weaker.
I want to ask you then, as it continues to fire on the Gulf, you mentioned that the Gulf don't want an unstable Iran, but they don't want kind of a wounded government that will, restart its attacks at any point. It's shown its ability to disrupt the global economy. What does the ideal outcome of this war look like for the Gulf states in terms of both in Tehran, in Washington, D.C.? How does this end in a way that is acceptable to them, if not satisfactory?
Well, I think we've gone from ideal to satisfactory to acceptable. And I think that let's climb down that ladder. Ideal is, a regime change that puts into power a government in Iran that concentrates on its own economic development, that partners with regional states, that doesn't support non-state actors and doesn't try to spread revolutionary ideology. I think that that's the least likely result that we're going to see from this war. I think that if you go to satisfactory and acceptable, I think that a regime in Iran that still calls itself an Islamic Republic, that still is based on some element of a clerical military coalition, but that is willing to accept limitations on its nuclear program, that is willing to accept that it can't conduct, it can't benefit from conducting military actions against the Gulf states, that is willing to limit and be a bit more cooperative in its role in the region, or at least perhaps not encourage as much instability in the region through their proxies as they have in the past. I think that that would be more than acceptable in the Gulf states. And that's a much more likely outcome than either complete state collapse, which I think would be the worst outcome for the Gulf states in Iran, or this kind of best case scenario of a stable new regime that's willing to play ball.
And you mentioned obviously there are no good options for the Gulf right now in terms of their security, and that the UAE might be rethinking its policies and its model. What kind of rethink could be taking place in Riyadh, if any, in terms of their security policies in the region? Do you think this war has been a similar watershed moment for them?
I don't think we're going to see a major rethink in Riyadh. I think that there will be difficult conversations with the Trump administration, but on the whole, I think that Riyadh has kind of set a policy, as we've discussed, a few moments ago, of trying to encourage a stable regional environment for its own economic purposes, and to the extent that Riyadh and Saudi Arabia have suffered fewer attacks in the war, they might be, less pushed to rethink. So I don't see a big rethink coming from Riyadh, although I think there'll be some difficult conversations with the Trump administration about, how can you have put us out here, like, without considering our security. The rebuilding steps on Gulf-US relations are going to revolve around a couple of things. They're going to revolve around kind of an American Gulf understanding that, that the Gulf militaries didn't do a bad job on air defense. Even though some things got through, they shut down the vast majority of these things. And one of the ways that cooperation is going to advance is through kind of American technology supplying the Gulf to build up those air defense systems even more. I think that will be an area of movement and cooperation between the two sides. I think that the Gulf states will remind the Trump administration that when Israel struck Qatar back in September of 2025, the Trump administration was very critical of Israel's attack on a close U.S. ally, the location of America's largest military base in the region, and I think that they'll urge the Trump administration to use their influence with Israel to reduce that kind of destabilizing behavior.
Do you think they could use financial, maybe not threats, but hinting at the withdrawal of investments and so on if the US doesn't take a harsher line with Israel? Or do you believe they're not really in a position to do that?
I don't like to get into the head of President Trump, but I think it's pretty obvious that he doesn't react well to threats. And it seems to me that the way you deal with him, and the Gulf states have felt this out and are pursuing this, is it's not through threats, but through inducements. I would see that as being the more likely path.
I guess my final question, which is among the most difficult to ask, do you see this war's end coming when the Gulf can no longer sustain the pressure of Iranian attacks, or which will motivate Trump to kind of declare victory and sell it in the way that he does? Or do you see the government in Tehran blinking first, if you had to say how this war ends?
Neither. I think this war ends when the domestic costs for President Trump within the United States, a combination of rising gasoline prices at the pump, falling stock market, and splits within his own coalition, his own Republican MAGA coalition, eventually convinced the president that this war is doing him more harm than good domestically. I don't think that the price being paid by the Gulf states is going to be enough to drive President Trump to change his approach to this conflict. It's going to be these domestic pressures within the U.S. And since I don't see a high likelihood of a complete regime change in Iran, which would be the occasion for, if you will, a formal surrender, it seems to me that the way this war is going to end is because of what's going on domestically in the U.S. And frankly, we're already seeing signs of rethink in the Trump administration. I personally would be surprised if this war lasts through the end of this month.
And before I let you go, one factor that you think is being overlooked right now when we discuss the trajectory of the war and potential Gulf involvement in it?
I would just repeat, my sense of what will bring this conflict to a close. I think folks outside of the United States tend to underestimate the way that President Trump himself personally views his standing domestically as the most important thing to him. And to the extent that the war is harming that, that'll be the thing that drives its close.
Gregory Gause, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today. It was a real privilege to hear your insights on Saudi Arabia, the entire Middle East, and the US administration under President Trump. Thank you so much for offering your perspective, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon, hopefully.
It was my pleasure.